we have some examples. In fact, Piers has an example, which I think is really very funny, of being told something and then a couple of weeks later, he arrived when we were working one morning. He arrived and he said, "Oh my goodness, and this is what had happened." You might tell that one. I'm talking about the division problem, Piers.
Oh, yes. Oh, well, I mean, Ros was struck by this story more than me, but I was, yes. It turns out, and I was actually quite good at maths as a child. You know, I really was quite good at maths, and yet it took me until sort of mid-adulthood before somebody said to me, well, actually, division is two really quite different processes. You know, we talk about sort of 20 divided by 3, and in fact, 20 divided by 3 can be looked at in two entirely different ways. You still get the same answer. Let's take an easier answer. 21 divided by 3. Let's not have any fractions involved. But 21 divided by 3 can be thought of as taking 21 and dividing it into 3 portions. Mm-hmm. Or it can be thought of as taking 21 and how many units of 3 can you fit into 21? And they're called chunking and cutting. I forget what the words are in English for these two different ways of looking at division. And, you know, I'd never realized that there were these two ways of looking at division. I just did it without ever thinking about conceptually what it was I was doing. Anyway, Rebecca Hansen was the person who actually explained this to me. And then about 3 weeks later, I thought I'd had the same idea for myself. Is this the story you're talking about, Ros? Yes. I was cycling back home on my bicycle, suddenly had a huge rush of whatever, and thought I'd reinvented or thought I'd invented this idea for myself, which is another feature of how we are as humans, that we get told things and then think we invent them. But in a sense I had, because it had been working away inside me, and suddenly I understood, and I'd just forgotten that actually what had prompted all this work going on inside me was somebody else giving me an idea, which I hadn't had before.
Yes, but it's a good example of the difference between the piece of knowledge, which was what Rebecca gave him, and then the awareness, which is accompanied by the sudden rush that he's just spoken about. And what we want are sudden rushes.
And which meant that this has now never left me. You know, we get told there's a million things a day. We're suffused in information which doesn't affect us in any way. What's means that I now can see division in those two different ways is because I did that work on it myself, clearly.
Right. And would you consider this thinking or reflecting or something else? Because there is also a lot of talk about the difference between thinking and reflecting, and that we learn by reflecting on our experiences. That's Dewey, and I'm wondering about this as we talk about getting you here.
We think, I mean, there was a British philosopher called Gilbert Ryle, who's now dead, but he wrote an article in about 1971 with a title or something like "On Thinking" or some name like that. And perhaps we can put a link to this in the chat box or in the box below this thing here. But you know, in answer to that question, words like thinking, clearly, whatever it is that we do when we think, a lot of it is completely inaccessible to us. We have no idea how thinking works. I mean, it's just silly. This is absolutely clear. There are lots of things that are unclear in neuroscience and psychology, but it's very clear that we have no introspection. A lot of the processes going on are happening without us having any entry point to them whatsoever. But we think that Gilbert Ryle's view on how thinking works is pretty good. And I don't want to spoil it for anybody else. Rather than hearing it from us, go ahead and read the article yourself. It's a joy to read, and I think there's some real insight in what he's saying.
Yes, and he talks a lot about teaching, so it really, really is worth reading.
That's interesting. Dance between consciousness and unconsciousness, perhaps.
Yes, very, very, very much so, yes.
Yes.